we've come together as Australians for Humanity. We want to see the Australian government being much more proactive in showing leadership diplomatically and giving practical support to the Palestinian people. This session will be chaired by Kate Lee. Kate, thank you for being with us. Kate is the CEO of Union Aid Abroad and, of course, needs no introduction. She and her three panelists have special experience working in development aid and special understanding of Palestine and the needs of the people, the desperate needs of the people there. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thanks, Margaret, and welcome everybody. Hello. As Margaret said, my name's Kate Lee, Executive Officer of Union Aid Abroad of FIDA, which is the International Solidarity Organisation of the Australian Union Movement. And thanks to the organisers of this conference today. I want to start by acknowledging that we meet on Aboriginal land and that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land here in Sydney. And so welcome, yes, to this panel discussion on humanitarian need and assistance in Gaza. As we all know, the genocide in Gaza has created a humanitarian catastrophe of unbelievable proportions, a man-made catastrophe, of which we have heard in panel one today, governments around the world have been complicit in allowing to continue. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza has also created aid responses the world has not seen before. So everything on the one hand from an outpouring of public fundraising globally, perhaps into the billions of dollars, and through to, on the other hand, the cruel and inhumane response of Israel and US governments in establishing the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, where hundreds of people have been crushed to death, desperate to get food. And so the weaponizing of humanitarian assistance has reached a new level in this war. Today's panel are going to provide a range of insights, including giving you an overview of the situation for those inside Gaza, desperate for essential medical care, food, and other support. Secondly, how humanitarian support is being delivered when in the hands of the UN, local organisations, and international NGOs. And thirdly, what the Australian government and the international community must do to ensure that Palestinian self-determination is paramount in this emergency response, but also in the longer-term development needs that are clearly evident now. So we have three great panelists today. And then after hearing from them for about 45 minutes, we'll have time for your questions. We're going to start by hearing from our first panelist who's going to share a PowerPoint presentation. And then we'll move on to questions to each of the panelists to draw out some of these themes. So in terms of who we've got on the panel, just to introduce them briefly, we have Dr. Bushra Othman, is a Palestinian Australian general surgeon who is currently doing her colorectal subspecialty training. She's a surgical course instructor with the Australian College of Surgeons, and she has a passion for medical education and global health. She's recently volunteered on 3 medical missions to Gaza with the Palestinian, Australian, and New Zealand Medical Association, PANSMA, who many of you would be familiar with. She's had a total of 3 months in Gaza since June 2024, and most recently exited on the 17th of June this year. Our second panelist is Rami Ajelda, who is a humanitarian specialist with more than a decade of experience in monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning work across the Middle East and North Africa. He spent 11 years with the Catholic Relief Services in Gaza, leading data and information systems that strengthened the humanitarian programs and supported communities in crisis. Having resettled in Australia after fleeing Gaza last year, Rami now brings his professional expertise and lived experience to advocate for humanitarian needs. And lastly, we have Michelle Higelin, who is the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia, which is part of a global federation working to advance women's rights and end poverty and injustice. And this includes working in Palestine over the last 2 decades with staff in both Gaza and the West Bank, who have been responding to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the escalating settler attacks in the West Bank. And Michelle has nearly 3 decades of experience working in the area of gender equality, human rights, and social justice in Australia and internationally. She's also the Vice President of the Australian Council for International Development, the peak organisation for aid organisations in Australia. So, without any further ado, I'm going to hand to Bushra, Dr. Bushra Othman, to begin our session. And you're going to drive, I think, the PowerPoint yourself. Is that right, Bushra?
That's right, Kate. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
great. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. And I also echo Kate's earlier comments that I'm coming to you from unceded Gadigal land. I could probably sit here for the whole hour and share some stories from my time in Gaza, but that's not going to work very well. So I thought I'd just try and share with you a few of the key things that I'd noticed. As Kate mentioned, I have done 3 different medical missions, mostly with the Palestinian Australian New Zealand Medical Association. And that was June in 2024, December 2024, and then June again in 2025. So I sort of had an opportunity to witness what this genocide had done on the ground over those 3 separate missions. Rami's online, so he might notice some of the familiarities of the streets or the areas. This last mission was the first time that I'd been up to the north. So I'd spent some time at a Shifa hospital, which probably most of us will know, which is in Gaza City, as well as Al-Quds Hospital, which is in Gaza City and is associated with the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. And the reason I wanted to show you this video is we're going up the main beach road, Shara Rashid, or Rashid Street. On my right-hand side, when I was in the car, this is what I see. It is very surreal to see whole suburbs completely flattened, 10, 15-story buildings completely reduced to rubble. There are potentially still humans and their remains that are underneath this rubble. And on the left-hand side, all along the beach road, were tents that had been set up because people had been displaced so many times and there was nowhere else to go. When we talk a little bit about, doing medical mission work, it's really brought into focus for me about what are the determinants of health and what actual structures allow us to be able to deliver care, especially on the ground. Now, as we've all heard about, Israel has made a very concerted effort to destroy on purpose all of the faculties of living that allow people to survive. The top right-hand photo there is in Deir el-Balah, which is in the central area, with sewage overflowing on the street because of the attacks on water sanitation plants. They've made it a key to going after where people are living in their tents, either on the beach or hiding out in not only hospitals, but also universities and schools. They've hit multiple electricity power plants, they've hit communication servers. So in no way have they made it at all possible for survival. And yet on top of that, as we know from earlier this year, by the time I'd entered on the 12th of June, there had been over 4 months of an enforced starvation, let alone the limitations in what medical missions and the convoys can bring in, which is 1 suitcase and 1 backpack. Just last week, sutures, medications were thrown out of the luggage from doctors entering into Gaza. Put on top of all of that, bombs, missiles, quadcopters, Apaches, and drones constantly surrounding you, never giving you a moment of peace. So this is a small video of that beach area. I put it to anyone here online, can you honestly imagine that your life has been reduced to living in one of these tents, which is on the beach, with no proper access to water, toileting, bathroom, cooking, and how you would actually survive on a day-to-day basis. Pictured in the top left-hand corner are two of my surgical colleagues. So Dr. Rajab on the right, I mean, he managed to get his wife and his kids out to Egypt, but he's been separated from them for over a year and a half now. And yet he's a newly minted general surgeon providing his care and services in Gaza. Dr. Nazar on the left is one of the junior surgical doctors. His brother was up in the north and they'd been displaced from him for months. And on the final day of the supposed ceasefire that was going to take effect earlier this year in January, Israel made it a point to bomb their home where his brother was staying, and he died mere moments, or he was murdered, I should say, mere moments before the ceasefire took effect. This is Dr. Haytham. He's one of the general surgeons who also works at Al-Quds Hospital. So this hospital was besieged in November 2023. The army would fire bullets and guns towards the doctors, especially if they would see them near the windows. He took me through the main building that had been set alight on fire by the Israeli military when they'd come in, and the main room where they stored most of the medical equipment, including ultrasounds and other specialized airway equipment, was torched and set fire to worse than any other place inside the hospital. And again, I make this point of really reiterating these facts because there can be no other explanation of why a military should set fire to a hospital, should fire with their guns towards healthcare workers within a hospital, or purposely destroy equipment, other than to say that they do not want the local population to be able to survive. Yet the resilience and the endurance of the healthcare workers in particular in Gaza means that they are continuously rebuilding despite everything happening around them. And so as we're walking, in one area, seeing the destruction, on the other side, you were seeing them put to work to rebuild. These are some of the windows near the operating theatre where we would be, and sometimes we'd walk out there to have a look out onto the street to see the hustle and bustle of Gaza city life. And these are where the army tanks had fired on the healthcare workers. This is Dr. Ahmed Siyam in the top left-hand corner in the green scrubs. He was at home with his wife and kids when a missile strike hit their apartment building. There was no warning. It was unprecedented. He managed to pull his kids out of the rubble. He came in just like what we see online, covered from head to toe in soot and rubble, holding and cradling one of his youngest kids, Jumana, who's pictured there, who's only 3 years old. His wife was in a pool of her own blood on the emergency department floor with a fractured leg. And he is just one of many stories of healthcare workers who've been attacked, targeted, or murdered by Israel over the last 24 months. I might skip to just showing you guys a quick few things about, Kate mentioned the GHF, this humanitarian fund that was supposedly there to deliver aid. It was really state-sanctioned slaughterhouses. That's exactly what they were. Because although I've only chosen a couple of segments to talk to you about, I could go on and on about all of the different patients that were brought in. Some of these young men that are pictured on the floor of the emergency department at Al-Shifa, the one with the abdominal packs over his wound has got most of his bowel outside of his abdominal cavity. The chaos that ensues when you have mass casualties brought in, when people are panicking, when it's hot in the summertime, when they don't know what's going on, let alone you're trying to look for a pair of gloves to put on to be able to try to assess them, is difficult, honestly, to explain in words unless you're there. This is Naveen, one of my patients, a 42-year-old mother whose baby girl was so desperately crying for food the whole day that she thought she would go out to the so-called distribution sites to try and get some food. Now you can see from the bottom right-hand photo, her lower legs and her feet there, how starved she is. Lo and behold, she was shot by either the army tanks or some snipers. She had a bullet wound going in from her left buttocks that came out from her left abdominal wall, and you can see her bowel on view there. Sorry, I completely forgot to give people a warning about some of these videos and photos. Now, by the time that she is even presented to a Shifa hospital and then been transferred to Al-Quds for me to be able to operate on her, we're talking at least 2 or 3 hours down the track. She had massive hemorrhage inside her abdomen. And in your heart of hearts, you know that there is probably no chance that you will be able to save her. And yet you still commit to doing the work with the locals because what other choice do you honestly have? And by the time we got her to intensive care, she had passed away only 5 or 10 minutes later. And I don't know who would have gone to tell her daughter the news that her mother was murdered while trying to get food. This is Nidal. He's a 16-year-old boy who was also at one of these sites to try to get food for his family. Now, his dad was with him. Why only the son managed with, ended up with a bullet into his abdomen. No one understands how fate goes. Luckily for him, he had some bowel injuries that were certainly salvageable, and so he survived from this. And he is just one of these countless stories as to how the world has stood by while Israel and its US backers have allowed
Yes.
Palestinians to go and get food and then be shot at. It's unbelievable. And then to top it all off on that same 24-hour period, when I was still at Al-Quds, there was some displaced families in the Zaytun neighborhood in their tents who were bombed. We've got these two 12-year-old boys that were brought in as twins. The one on the left-hand side, we don't even know his name. His left arm there has been auto-amputated by shrapnel. He's covered in burns and smoke, and he took his dying breaths on that mattress. His brother is there pictured on the right-hand side. He's also ended up with a left lower leg amputation, in order just to control the bleeding. His severe burns over the majority of his body meant that he went to the intensive care. Luckily for him, there was an intensive care bed for him. And he was so severely unwell overnight that we thought he might be bleeding into his abdomen. When we've gone in to check, he didn't have anything there that would account for his demise, but he also went back to intensive care and soon followed his brother into heaven. And again, how the world has stood for 2 years of us saying that displaced people are being bombed in their tents is beyond egregious. And maybe just one of the final things that I'll share, because otherwise I'll go way over time. This is another 13-year-old girl who's actually a relative of one of the healthcare workers here in Australia. She was outside her tent putting the washing on the line and had come back inside, and then stood at the front entrance of her tent and was shot by a quadcopter. So, someone might say to me, oh, how can you corroborate who's actually shot these people? Well, you've got witnesses. Her mother was there. These people have had most of their lives under Israeli occupation, and they know when they're being targeted. Evil and violence on a daily basis. And I will just mention this actually as my last slide, and then I'll stop there, Kate. So this is Hussam. He's one of my colleagues at Al-Aqsa Hospital. He's a scrub nurse in the operating theatres. He's been displaced with his family in a tent for the majority of the time during this genocide. A missile strike hit their tent. There he is carrying his 9-year-old boy in that left-hand photo, Rizq, who was murdered during that strike, and his 4-year-old twin boys were also murdered. His 11-year-old daughter, Leanne, has ended up with a fracture of her leg, but has survived, and him and his wife have had some minor injuries. Now, they've lost all their belongings, anything that they'd managed to put together to build a home for the last 2 years, and were displaced inside the hospital. And you can imagine what can I say when I call him from Gaza City to express my condolences and sorrow at what he has experienced. And yet when I'd made it back down to the south for a few days to finish off at Al-Aqsa Hospital, he made sure that him and his family wanted to invite me to spend dinner with them every night from whatever it is that they'd managed to piece together. And that just goes to show you that despite the evil and the violence that Israel has shown to everyone in Gaza for the last 2 years, that the people of Gaza themselves are beyond generous, beyond courageous, and have a will to live in a spirit that is undeniable and can never be broken. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bushra. I'm sure the audience today, like me, is feeling, a deep sense of sadness, although it's beyond sadness, as well as deep fury that this is allowed to continue. And thank you for all the work of you and your PANSMA colleagues in contributing and supporting the doctors in Gaza and the health staff in Gaza.
Thank you.
Just to start off with a question to you, I know that PANSMA is planning. I mean, look, if this ceasefire, let's call it that, for want of a better word, although we know that the bombings are continuing, but if this holds for some time, PANSMA has planned 20 medical missions into Gaza over the next year and is raising money for those, and I think successfully has raised the money. What do you and your colleagues from PANSMA, what are you planning to do on those missions? What are you planning to prioritize, and how are you planning to work in the way that might have changed from what you've done so far?
Yeah. Thank you. Excellent questions. One point that I'll make is that as much as I've gone on 3 medical missions, and as much as it's important for internationals to go there to bear witness, to provide technical skill and physical support for the local healthcare workers who are, beyond exhausted or burnt out. I'm not sure even what the word would be to describe them. In the end, a point to remind people is that before October 2023, and probably even, before the Intifada from a few years ago and every other assault that's ever happened, Gaza itself had strong healthcare facilities. I mean, a Shifa hospital would rival any of our tertiary facilities here in Australia. It was certainly the biggest one across the occupied Palestine territory. And yet on the flip side, you have Israel holding control of the borders, so preventing people from going in and out. And the reason that I think that that's important to mention is that, you're talking about what kind of work are we going to be doing if this supposed ceasefire holds. I mean, the majority of the work during the last 2 years was trauma related, but I think heavily about all of the cancer patients. So, I diagnosed multiple young women in their 30s with metastatic breast cancer who've got no ability to access. There is some access actually to chemotherapy at the moment, but no real ability to have screening, surveillance, radiotherapy, or any form of true cancer care that we would expect. In December, neonates or, infants, babies that were being born with heart conditions that if they had an operation would be life-saving, were being prevented from leaving Gaza, being prevented by Israel to be able to go and have these life-saving procedures. I mean, if that's not the most evil, barbaric thing that I've ever heard on top of everything else, it was mind-blowing to me to think that even babies were being denied access to care. So I think moving forward, what are the priorities for medical missions in an organization like PANSMA? Some of it is assessing the needs on the ground to really being able to utilize the skill set of people on the outside to come in and help. So now, part of our focus will be in terms of sending subspecialty doctors and or nurses. So that might mean subspecialty surgeons, especially in terms of reconstruction, cancer services, like I mentioned, obstetricians and gynecologists. I mean, every day there are still 70 to 100 kids being born and maternity servers are lacking. And so it goes hand in hand to say that we certainly don't know better than the people on the ground in Gaza as to what their needs are. They have the aptitude and the abilities to being able to provide care, but they need their hospitals not to be being bombed and targeted. They need the local population to be able to eat and drink so that they can actually go to work and do their duties and perform their care to their patients. And we need to have an understanding as to how to really do capacity building on the ground. And so in this, if you want to call it humanitarian space or medical mission space, things are very, very fluid. So what we think we can do with missions next week or the week after, in terms of planning for months ahead, is going to be changed by Israel whenever they want. So, as I was mentioning, even now, basic medical equipment that can be taken in by these medical mission teams is almost non-existent. And so, how can we really service the population if we're not allowing medical services, medications, medical care, and equipment to actually be able to enter Gaza? So it's a mammoth task, and the hope is that we'll continually just be reassessing to figure out with our partners on the ground as to how to be able to service the community of Gaza to our best possible way.
Okay, thank you. Bushra, I might come back to you later if we have time to ask you some further questions. But Rami, you've worked for over 10 years in Gaza, ensuring quality programming in humanitarian support, helping build the systems that help people most in need. So, look, from your perspective, tell us how you were in Gaza for the first year, I think, of after October 2023 and working as part of that system. Can you tell us about how that system worked and how, the UN agencies, the INGOs and the local NGOs worked in concert in order to do their best, really, to provide quality care under horrible circumstances?
Thanks, Kate. Actually, hi everyone. This is really I just like trying to to speak about what's happening in Gaza. Bushra has tried to visualize everything that is going right now, and I'm as someone who lived the first 7 months in Gaza, I just want to say that those pictures and stories are never enough to actually visualize and explain what's happening. If you're there, you would feel it differently. Everything is destroyed, everything is gone, and organizations there are trying their best to do the best to deliver assistance to everyone. In general, I used to work for Catholic Relief Services, which is an international American organization, and there is a system there. As someone who worked in the monitoring, evaluation, and making sure quality programming in place, humanitarian actors, agencies, they're doing their best to do cross-checking with Ministry of Social Development in Ramallah, making sure that there are clusters, also international organizations. Those kind of organizations are really very important because they make sure that all the lists of participants who would receive emergency support like food support, cash support, health, hygiene, all of that is very necessary during the war itself. It's really important to do those kind of steps where making sure that there are no overlaps. They're trying to cover the most number of people who need the assistance as much as possible, and making sure that money is not going to someone who is going to use it in a wrong way. The involvement of the international agencies during emergency programming and even after the war itself is very important because the systems there, they make sure that there are accountability standards, making sure that quality targeting, making sure that everyone who would receive the assistance really need it by creating criterias, by making sure that everything is fair in terms of who would receive something. During the war itself, there could be many organizations who would do blanket coverages because, as Bushra showed you in the beginning, that what she was able to capture from the window while she was on a Rashid Street and everything is flattened, that's everywhere. That's everywhere, everywhere. Like there's nothing there now. Israel has done their best, took this opportunity to wipe Gaza. I think we all can see it. This is a fact that this is very like clear that they're trying to wipe everything. This is like a chance for them. And honestly, there are many people in Gaza who want to live. You can see people, the hospitality of Gazans, how much we would love to see someone coming from outside. When I used to live in Gaza, I would love to see someone who works with that, like as an expat, like Bushra, for example, coming from Panzma, we were trying to show them how we are living. We're really very happy. We have dignity. We don't want any assistance from anyone, but this is the situation that happened. As someone who was working with a humanitarian organization, I can say that cooperation, making sure that there are clusters, making sure that there are international organizations on the ground who can facilitate the work, also doing capacity building to local organizations and making sure that the local organizations who work with them are really the right ones who would really deliver assistance based without any discrimination, without having any political groups, just pure humanitarian to people who need it, elderly, children, women, people who need aid. I can talk for hours, but honestly, like um um I don't know what to say here. I hope that the Australian government would be able to really make sure that they can do the funding. Right now, I think the most important thing is to stop the war. Border.
Mhm.
You can give money from everywhere in the world. Everyone in the world would send money to Gaza, but then money enough is not enough because how you can get the medical equipment, how you can get the most important things functioning again, like electricity, hospitals, universities, everything without allowing them to enter. I think the most important thing right now is advocacy, making sure that everyone would advocate that
Mhm.
this has to stop. People, humans, have to live. They lost everything, but we have been into too many conflicts before, but we were able to go back and stand up again. But this time it's really different, and we want the war to stop. This is right now ceasefire. They say that this is ceasefire, and every single moment, like you don't know what's happening. There's bombing again, there's shooting again. Honestly, the world has to know that this has to stop. That's what I can speak about this
Thank you,
right
Rami.
now.
Thanks. Look, I just want to pick up on, you made the point there. Advocacy is the most important thing to you right now. But I'm going to come back and prompt you and ask you to expand a little bit on something in a minute. But in this morning's panel, we had some speakers that talked about the features of a future Palestine and what needs to happen, which of course included things like ending the occupation, a rights anchored constitution, the right of return, restitution, compensation, freedom of movement and rights, and an equal legal regime so that people had the capacity to vote, citizenship, etc. So thinking about your experience as a development worker, and when you think about the principles of what's important for longer term development work, and bearing in mind the advocacy needed to get to that point, can you expand a little bit more around what's important to you in terms of the principles for longer term development work?
I believe that to strengthen Palestinian self-determination, it takes time and there should be a clear strategy. The key is to shift gradually from emergency relief into a long-term economic empowerment. And in the early stages, right now, I believe that it should be only emergency because there's nothing there. People need food, water, shelter, safety before anything else. But once there is stability and once stability is restored, I'd say the focus should be on making sure that people there are not dependent and they have the self-determination and that would allow them to stand on their feet again. If when everything is back functioning, market is functioning, businesses are functioning, hospitals, I believe that international aid should focus on providing assistance to programs that would be including like enhancing local businesses, supporting vocational trainings, employment programs, so that people would really rely on themselves. They wouldn't be relying on international aid. That's not something that I believe international aid should focus on. Creating job opportunities, simulate local economy, supporting Palestinians to do that. But honestly, right now, like that's the long term. Right now, it should be a pure emergency relief.
Thank you. Thank you, Rami. You've set that out really clearly in terms of what the expectations should be for people that are trying to support and assist. I want to move to you, Michelle, now. And, as we've been discussing, obviously this war in Gaza has created not just one of the biggest humanitarian crises, but it's quite unprecedented in the way in which the humanitarian policy and approach has been undertaken, and it has shocked many of us in terms of that. Can you give us a bit of an overview of how this is different, and the problems with the approach that we've seen to date?
Thanks, Kate. And it's a real honor to share this space with Bushra and Rami, who obviously have that first-hand experience having been in Gaza. And good afternoon, everyone. Look, I think one thing is clearly the scale, which I think both Bushra and Rami have spoken about. And it's not just the fact that 90% of the population has been displaced multiple times. It's the fact that 95% of infrastructure and buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. So even now, as we look towards some kind of ceasefire, there's nowhere for people to go. So I think this is a real challenge, because I don't think we've seen this in any other humanitarian situation, or the level of destruction of civilian infrastructure, the things like the hospitals. And I'd say, I think the bigger issue here is just the rampant violations of international humanitarian law. I think that's the really acute thing we're seeing in the situation in Gaza, and the fact that it's been allowed to continue without international intervention. An occupying power is obliged under international law to ensure impartial aid access. And, as we've started to talk about already, this has been, a frequent violation. Gaza has been under a blockade for more than 18 years, but, since this war began, we've seen, restrictions on water, fuel, food, other medical supplies from entering Gaza. And obviously this was most acute in March this year, where everything was stopped from entering. Absolutely everything. No food, no water, nothing to support people, which in fact engineered the famine that we're now seeing now, where, about a third of the population, so 640,000 people, are experiencing famine right now. And that could have been prevented. And even, we talked about the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. This is not impartial aid access. We know it's an Israeli and US controlled mechanism with absolutely no humanitarian experience in Gaza, delivering aid, which is set at a level which is not sufficient for people to survive. It's been designed to make sure people are malnourished, they are in need, and they can't meet their basic living standards, as well as the absolute violence that we've seen accompanied by, the GHF that's been spoken about, the killing of desperate people trying to access aid. I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight, and now is another, mechanism of preventing aid, using aid as a weapon of war, is the restrictions that are now being imposed on NGOs from delivering aid. So, what's now required is that all international NGOs that have been delivering aid for the last 2 years are now required to register with Israel to be able to access and to be able to provide aid and support. And these laws are effectively designed to silence any NGO that has spoken out against Israel. So any organisation that's, called out forced displacement, that's called for sanctions, that's called for an end to the arms trade, that's exposed the violations of international law, are likely not to be registered. And if we just look at, what's happened over the period October 10th to 21st, 17 NGOs had shipments of food, water, medical supplies blocked by Israel on the basis that they were not authorized to deliver aid. And, basically 94% of requests coming from NGOs to deliver aid are being refused. And so it's just a crazy situation. $50 million worth of humanitarian aid is sitting at the border or in warehouses close by, ready to come into Gaza to respond to the huge humanitarian need, and it is being blocked and denied. And so I think it's really important that we don't equate a ceasefire with the free flow of aid. We're still seeing that restriction. Israel has not delivered on that part of the agreement. And, we can easily solve the situation of the hunger, the malnutrition. I think some of it is permanent damage, but we could easily solve it. There's enough global support to be able to do that, but Israel continues to block. And I think it's a real challenge that so many Western governments have been complicit in this as well. And not putting more pressure on Israel to be able to, to allow that sort of free flow of aid. I think that's a real shame. And I think also, if we look at comparable humanitarian situations like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We immediately saw the Australian government come out and impose sanctions on Russia. We're not seeing that level of, we haven't seen any sanctions by Australia on the officials who have created and engineered a famine in Gaza. So, yeah, I would just say, I think for me, the biggest issue we have here are the blatant violations of international humanitarian law that have just continued and continued and continued.
Thanks, Michelle. And look, a follow-up question. We know that Australia's response so far has fallen far too short for many of us right across Australia, particularly those of us who call for sanctions and justice through international mechanisms. So far, the Australian government has provided about $130 million in aid since the start of the war. It has backed UNRWA, unlike some countries around the world, and it's denounced the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. But what do aid organisations in Australia want from our government? What are they calling for?
Yeah, look, through the Australian Council for International Development, we have been calling for the government to ensure the free flow of aid. And I think now it's going to be critical for Australia to hold Israel to the terms of the ceasefire agreement. 4,200 trucks are meant to come in weekly into Gaza, and we haven't seen anywhere near that level. So Australia does need to, put more pressure on Israel to deliver on those terms, as well as to actually stop the violence. Because I think that's critical for, the people of Gaza, is to end this sort of continued attack and destruction. We've also been calling on Australia to uphold its obligations under the Genocide Convention. We're all aware that, the UN Independent Commission has found that genocide is occurring. The ICJ also ruled earlier in January 2024 that it was plausible that genocide was occurring. So, Australia has to end its military cooperation with Israel. That's a critical thing it must do, and it has to stop hiding behind this, international agreement of cooperation, military cooperation among a number of countries. Australia is one of the countries that's aided and abetted this genocide, and it needs to cease that to be in line with its international commitments. I think ACFID has also been calling for Australia to enable safety for humanitarian personnel, so that they can safely deliver aid. As well as making sure that this registration process is blocked, because it's only going to continue to limit the number of NGOs who can meet and work to bring in support to meet the huge needs. I think from ActionAid's perspective, I would say, absolutely right now, the critical thing for the Australian government, once we can get a lasting ceasefire and get the free flow of aid, is that we see accountability of Israel for the war crimes committed. Australia has to be a strong voice for this. It's critical. There have been so many violations, and I don't think we can get out there on the international stage and talk about the rule of law and how important it is if we can't uphold that and hold Israel to account. And I think, I'm sure, as many people have said, we have to get at the heart of the root cause of this conflict, which is the continued occupation of Palestine by Israel. I think we haven't even touched upon the situation in the West Bank, but 1,000 new gates have been put up over this last 2 years, which are restricting the movement of people in the West Bank, keeping them locked in open air prisons that are very hard to get through those checkpoints. So, there's even a situation there that we need to keep a lot more attention on, that's been sort of probably underplayed because of, such a catastrophic situation in Gaza. And I think, and as part of this sort of thinking about the root cause has to be the self-determination of the Palestinian people for the future of the state they want to see. We saw Australia welcome the peace deal, but no criticism about the sort of proposed governance structures.
Mm.
And so I think that's something we need to all, as the, civil society, we need to really put a lot more pressure on Australia to ensure that, Palestinian people are able to govern the future of Gaza. And it's been quite alarming to see just in recent days the establishment of the US-Israeli Coordination Centre for Gaza, which is designed to manage the future of the Gaza Strip with a goal to provide solutions to the rebuilding of Gaza and ensure its demilitarization. And this reeks so much of foreign control, Israeli control, US control in the future of Gaza. And I think we need to challenge those kind of models for any kind of permanent and lasting peace.
Thanks, Michelle. And yes, that new coordination centre that's just been reported on in the last couple of days. Yes, another example of Occupy control. That's for sure. Bushra, would you like to add something there?
Honestly, Michelle, what a great summary of the situation at hand. The only extra things I wanted to add really is just that, there's this premise that everyone around the world understands that, this is quote unquote this humanitarian catastrophe, and therefore these international NGOs and medical mission teams that want to go in should be able to provide help. Up to 50% of the medical mission teams are being denied by Israel within 12 hours of when they're meant to enter. Michelle's given you all the statistics about NGOs re-registering and basically having chains around their neck about how they're unable to help. It's the same thing for anyone who even gets approval to get into Gaza, whether that be a doctor or a nurse or any other healthcare worker. And then beyond that, Rami mentioned advocacy. I think maybe what it needs to be is the coupling of advocacy with action in the face of complete hypocrisy and double standards. So, me and some of my healthcare colleagues from ANZ Doctors for Palestine had been meeting with representatives from Senator Penny Wong's office. And for over a year, they'd been telling us about, that they wanted to work together with these other countries to protect internationals that were going in on these aid sites. And I kept saying to them, well, there are already international laws and conventions that state that international healthcare workers or aid workers should be protected. What are we doing about the fact that we're not addressing that there are endless receipts of Israel blatantly abusing these laws and targeting them? So, there's no point in saying that the Australian government wants to help protect me, Dr. Bushra, going to Gaza as a surgeon, when in fact Israel can bomb whoever and whenever they want, and there is no accountability for that. So it doesn't matter if we have 50 million or billion dollars from global support around the world to try to rebuild infrastructure and provide basic dignity for the Palestinian people if Israel is not going to be prevented from how its course of actions have led to our present day scenario.
Yes, absolutely, Bushra. I'm just looking at the Q&A. There's one question, the most recent one is really directed to the panel. The question is, given Israel and the US say they will not allow certain organizations in, will you redirect teams to work through the most acceptable organizations so as to get food and materials in? Notwithstanding the discussion we've had about the difficulties in doing that, of course.
Look, ActionAid already, while we have staff on the ground, we also have worked through a number of local partners. And, as far as we understand at the moment, local NGOs are not being, I guess, contained in the same way as international NGOs, because it's the international NGOs that obviously can take a bit of the international media stage, speak out against the violations. So we will continue to deliver through local partners, even if we get deregistered. That is a reality. And it's critical that we continue to support and grow Palestinian civil society, which has also been decimated through this. The incredible work that so many of our partners have continued to do as their offices are blown up, as they no longer have homes, their families have been affected, is incredible. So we will continue to do that. And I think that's been the approach. I don't think I think every organisation will have a different way of doing it, but it's critical that we do support the local partners. At the moment, all of the international NGOs are working through the sector body in Palestine to have an organised response to this. Many of the larger NGOs have gone first in the registration process, because that will really tell us also, if it is designed to, shut us all out. And we've already started to see a few organisations deregistered, but many denied the authorisation.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I'm going to go to a question to each of you. We've got some time left, so I'm going to ask each of you to respond to a broader question about civil society in Australia, and how we, across our organisations of civil society, what we do now to hold our government to account, in terms of its advocacy for both humanitarian and medical support to Gazans, of course, along with the other bigger questions about accountability, particularly putting Palestinians and their ability to be front and center of any response moving forward. So just asking for your thoughts about civil society, our role in Australia in holding our government to account on those things. Perhaps Rami, you might like to jump in first. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for the question. I think that the civil society is very powerful, and I can clearly say, I want to just give an example. For example, like we all have seen that march that happened on the bridge a couple of months ago, and we also how this is really wasn't expected. Um, and after that, the government has announced additional funding, I believe, to Gaza, and this is can confirm that civil society and the public is really, really very important, because that will encourage many people who are afraid to speak out, many people who would feel like they don't understand what's going on when they see this is a big event. For example, that's something, I'm not trying here to say that let's go for another march, but what I want to say is that public can educate each other and aware everyone about what's actually happening here. And I believe everyone would be encouraged that that's the right thing to do. There are people who need it. This is going to keep the issue visible the whole time, and making sure that no one is forgetting what's actually happening. We here are living right now. I'm living here, but at the same exact time, there are many people dying in Gaza, and they should live in a dignity and in a good way, in a better way. Yeah.
Thanks, Rami. Absolutely. Bushra, your thoughts?
So many thoughts.
Yeah.
But so I think the things that come to mind, first and foremost, everyone has a voice and should be encouraged and feel powerful enough to use it to advocate, and to enact change. Because, what Rami's talking about is the visibility. So when people are wearing their kufiya, when I'm wearing my hijab with this kufiya pattern on it, when I wear a shirt with poetry from a writer in Gaza, anything that sort of brings something to the conversation to keep it front and center allows us to continue the conversations that can expand and educate people, and then hopefully allow further action to take place. But coupled with that, you have to have pressure. So it doesn't work to only do one thing once and then never follow up on it, or never sort of ask for an action or a change to occur, especially from our government, and then not follow up on that. So, what they're banking on is our emotional burnout and feeling overwhelmed and helpless with the situation at hand, to not continue our pressure and advocacy, to enforce them to change, really. The second thing is that, maybe I'll speak to my community. I mean, I'm a doctor, I'm a surgeon. I've been working now for the last 15 years. And the medical community has been completely atrocious in what they have done about the whole situation in Gaza. So there's doxing, there's censorship. We're not even allowed to have grand rounds about people's medical mission experience and what they learned or saw shared with their hospitals or their healthcare colleagues, for fear that it would endanger or be too much for a certain population. And so we just have to keep the momentum up. In particular, say, for example, in the healthcare space, we took an oath, we took this medical oath to say that we would treat all humans equally, that everyone is deserving of medical care, We're seeing this be completely decimated and desecrated in Gaza. And so why is there this discombobulation, this separation between what we know should be happening and what is blatantly not happening? And so it's just constantly feeling like we need to publish. So whether that be writing articles, whether that be writing opinion pieces, doing education sessions, anything really, including these webinars, are a great way to be able to advocate, to educate, to network and bring people together. Because in the end, it's really going to be a collective voice that has the most pressure rather than just the individuals. But that collective voice is made up of many, many individuals having to really think about committing their time, energy, and effort and sacrificing a little bit more in order to push for a change to get to that civil society. And in the end, the only extra point that I would say is that Michelle's given a little bit about, that question from earlier about, what can happen when international NGOs are being banned, and then what about if PANZIMA gets banned and we can't send in these medical missions? Somehow, somewhere, there is a way to fight, I shouldn't say fight, but to navigate this system into making things happen on the ground. Because if we hadn't figured out ways of doing things on the ground for the last 2 years, well, I actually don't know the position of what we'd find ourselves in now in terms of Gaza. So there is definitely hope that things can still occur. New organizations kept popping up, kept registering in order to be able to provide that care. Because again, it speaks to this unbreakable will by the masses in general, the population at large, to really being able to bring about some change for good in Gaza.
Want me to jump in,
Michelle?
Kate?
Yep, thank you.
Look, I think we just have to be really careful that we don't take our finger off the pulse, with the sort of so-called ceasefire, because we know it's not there yet. We know that there's still killing of people in Gaza, and there is still the denial of aid. So I would say we know that the Israeli lobby and media control is extensive. And so it's critical that anyone who cares about the rights, the dignity, the self-determination of the Palestinian people has to keep showing up. And whether it's marches, whether it's lobbying, whether it's continuing to work and support this effort, it's critical. And I think we also need to take a long-term view on it. The huge destruction means this situation will not be resolved anytime in the near future. In fact, I was reading the other day, it's going to take 5 years to just remove the rubble. And we're not even talking about rebuilding. So we're talking about a long-term commitment. So, and I think Australia needs to be there in the long term. We've been part of the problem. We need to be part of a long-term solution that supports the rights of the Palestinian people. And I think from a perspective with our government, we just need to keep challenging the double standards, and the sort of the things that we get out there on the international stage to make sure they are echoed in the situation in Gaza. If we want the rule of law, we need to also protect it in this situation. So I think let's keep up our pressure, and definitely I think this focus on accountability, I think now is a sort of a critical next step once we work through how this rebuilding process can favour the leadership and rights of Palestinian people.
Thanks, Michelle. And what I'm hearing from all of you, we need to be there for the long term. We need to challenge the silences within our own spheres as much as possible, retain visibility, especially given Trump claims the war has ended. And we need to build a collective voice together. But I just want to thank all of the panel, Rami, Bushra, and Michelle. Deep respect to you all for everything that you do, have done, and will do in the future. And all power to your arms and solidarity.